So, I just want to start today by sharing with you guys a little bit about why I left Harvard. So, and this kind of story sort of starts with, the reason I want to share this is because when we think about being successful or being a failure, and we think about, okay, what do I want to do with my life? A lot of times what we do is we define success as a particular external goal. So like, for example, we'll say like, like being an engineer at Google, or like being on a film set for like Netflix, or being a best-selling author, or, being faculty at Harvard Medical School is like how we sort of define success. And for a lot of us, what we tend to do is we kind of think about, okay, if I don't feel like I'm successful or I want to be successful, what I'll kind of do is pick that external target and I'll say like, okay, if I achieve that, then I will be successful. So when we think a little bit about what's the nature of success, what we sort of think about is an external target. The interesting thing is that being successful as a person, if you think about that framework, has nothing to do with you, right? Like the checkbox of success has nothing to do with you as an individual. It's just completely an external criteria. So people who go to Harvard are successful. That's kind of how we define it. And there's no individuality. There's no sense of like who that person is or what they want or what they care about. There's no kind of emphasis on your personal strengths or your ability to like make contributions to the world. When we think about success, all we sort of really think about is an external kind of perspective. And so that's something that, over time, what I've come to figure out is that, what we kind of consider as successful has not actually sort of led to me kind of being successful. I know it sounds kind of bizarre, but a lot of like my best decisions in life and a lot of the things that I think are really that I'm grateful for and proud of actually come from not moving towards success, but actually like moving away from success. And what I mean by that is there have been lots of times in my life where like something didn't feel right, even though on paper it was the right choice. And I think we're increasingly living in a world where like following what internally feels like it resonates with you and sort of like following kind of like, not to sound corny, but like following your heart actually does lead to some of the best outcomes. And if we really think about what makes you kind of the most successful, it has to be the things that are individual to you. And so I guess, like many places, the way that this story is going to start is like me failing out of college. And, when I was in high school, like, and people were asking me, like, what do I want to be when I grow up? I was I was a child of two doctors. Both of my parents were doctors. And so I realized that, like, being a doctor is a cool thing and was, like, socially respected. I didn't sort of understand this consciously, but I sort of recognized that, like, oh, people who are doctors, like, get respect. And, like, that's what I wanted. I was, like, a teenager, like, not in very good physical shape, had trouble talking to girls, like, didn't have a whole lot of friends, got bullied a lot, like, more in middle school and stuff, less so in high school, learned how to be invisible in high school. And so realized that, like, I wanted respect. And if I become a doctor, like, that's how I'm going to get people's respect. So people would ask me, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I would say, I want to be a doctor. And people would be, like, impressed, like, right there. And so I was like, great. So I was going to, and then I had dreams actually of when I started college and sort of majored in pre-med, that I was going to be an awesome doctor, and I was going to be the best, and I was going to go to the best place, and I was going to go to Harvard and all that kind of stuff. Right. Like most other, freshman pre-meds, I had big ambitions for myself. And that quickly didn't work out for me, right? Because I had no real reason to do it. It was just all about ego and satisfying other people and living up to an external standard of success. It had nothing to do with what I cared about. It had nothing to do with what I was aligned towards. It had nothing to do with what I was interested in. It's all for the sake of external success. So no surprise, I got a whopping like 1.2 GPA or something my first year in college. Like I was on academic probation, which is like I got like a D average, basically, like got like a B, maybe a couple of C's and a few F's. And so, that wasn't working out for me well. And so like at some point I decided that after my sophomore year, I increased my grades a little bit, was like solid, like 2.2 GPA kind of student. And so realized that like, this wasn't working. And so I went to India, and what I found in India was awesome. I absolutely loved it. And I was like, oh, what's also like super cool and super respectable is becoming a monk and like forsaking worldly things. And all those noobs who were chasing success and trying to be the best at everything and getting 4.0 GPAs, they're all materialistic. And you know what? I'm going to be better than them. I'm going to be not materialistic. So all those suckers over there who are succeeding at the things that I failed at, I'm going to devalue them in my mind by setting a goal for myself that's loftier and kind of bonus points, because that goal actually involves like not really playing their game to begin with. So I decided, my ego took an interesting spin, and I decided, okay, I'm going to become a monk, right? Because that's even cooler. Like, I'm going to forsake my worldly things. And so then I was like a monk, planning on becoming a monk for a while. So trained for several years and spent time, studying at monasteries in like India and South Korea and Japan and all that good stuff, mostly India. And so then I had like my idea of like what success was, right? So I'd abandoned the idea of being a doctor, and then I set a target. Like, I'm going to be like this revolutionary monk who like makes the world a better place, and I'm going to learn how to levitate and do all these cool things, because I did encounter Patanjali back then. And so, that's sort of what I gravitated towards. And I did work towards that goal, right? So I worked really hard, and I spent a lot of time. I did a lot of very rigorous meditation practices, and, spent time in like the Indian wilderness, like in isolation, like meditating basically all day long. And it was kind of actually like grueling and difficult. And I was like moving towards my goal, and like I actually learned a lot of good stuff, right? And then sort of what happened is I was kind of well on my path to becoming a monk, and I kind of met my wife, and then I got kind of confused. And like, here was this thing that I had built, like devoted 7 years of my life towards, right? So like I was on the road to becoming a very successful monk. And so I sort of like walked away from it because it just didn't feel right. Like, it just, something about becoming a monk didn't like resonate with me. I started to realize, as I actually did real spiritual training, like my reasons for becoming a monk were actually like very egotistical in nature. And so I had sort of this like ego of having no ego. So you'll see this in people who are, into spirituality, but not actually spiritual. Like, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And so there are people who will be like, oh, like, I don't want to be materialistic, so I'm not going to pay my bills. And I don't want to be like, I don't want to chase the rat race, and capitalism is evil and stuff like that. So can I borrow $20 and never pay you back? So it's like, oh, you're so attached to, like, man, like, you're so full of greed and you're so money minded. Like, I don't know why you're always asking me to pay you back. Like, why don't you just give me more money? Like, I don't understand, man. Be like not materialistic. Like, just let go, bro. Like, let go. By the way, can I borrow $20? And so like, so that I realized that I sort of had that kind of false spirituality where I used spirituality as an excuse to get away with all of like my baser needs and instincts. It was a way to use spirituality to absolve myself of responsibility. And I realized actually like, that was kind of all false. But even though I'd sort of trained for it, I kind of left. I walked away from it. It just didn't feel right. And then I was sort of screwed. Like, if you look at it like objectively, like, that was a terrible idea, right? So there I am at the age of 26. I have no professional experience practically. I've been out of college for like 3 years. I've got a crappy GPA, and like, I'm deciding not to forsake the world, and I'm going to try to like make it in this world. Like, that's terrible. My resume is crap. I haven't had a job. Like, if I try to get a job, like, people are going to ask me like, what have you been doing? I'm like, playing video games, maybe studying to become a monk. Like, I don't know. I haven't been doing much. So it's a terrible idea. And meanwhile, I had like, I had all these connections in India and had been doing like some stuff over there and like, even doing research and things like that. And I was being like groomed by a particular, organization to sort of like be, kind of like a missionary of sorts, right? I was going to be another one of these because I was like fluent in English and things like that. And so they were like, oh, like, you can go and like spread our message and stuff. So that was, it was good in some ways. But I decided to walk away, and then I kind of floundered a bit for a while again. And I struggled for a while. I like got back into school, like got a master's degree, like applied to medical school for a few years in a row, didn't get in. Finally got lucky and got into medical school. And then it was like, okay, well, what am I going to move towards? How am I going to be successful? And so then I decided I was going to become like a holistic cancer doctor, right? I was going to like save lives with like, I was going to like take these cancer patients, because like cancer is like a real disease, right? It's like a real problem, and I'm going to like save their lives, and it's going to be great. And I'm going to use like all this Eastern wisdom, and like it's going to be like holistic, and it's going to be holistic, and it's going to be holistic, and it's going to be awesome. So I positioned myself to like move towards that goal, right? And so, had thoughts about like, being the next Deepak Chopra or something like that. I don't know if I actually wanted to do that, but like just something like that. So I was going to be this like revolutionary, like missionary, visionary, like call it whatever you want to, all of the Aries. And so I did like, research in a rheumatology lab and like did all this stuff around like meditation and like, different kinds of physical illnesses, did some stuff around chronic pain. And I was like positioning myself, right? Then I sort of realized like what I really love is like talking to people, and what I really love is the mind. And so I really appreciate, an education and physical medicine. But what I really loved was psychiatry. And that got kind of tricky because then when I remember telling my mom, my dad had passed away at that point. I was like, hey, I'm thinking about being a psychiatrist. And she's like, oh, that's a bad idea. And then I talked to my grandmother, and she was like, well, if you become a psychiatrist, like you're going to go crazy yourself. So I went to my family and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about being a psychiatrist. Even went to my wife at the time and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing psychiatry. And she was like, neurosurgery? She was super into Grey's Anatomy at that point. She was like, because you've got the hair from McDreamy, you should become a neurosurgeon. I was like, no, I think I want to be a psychiatrist. And so she was, not thrilled at the beginning, but was actually really supportive. And so then I ended up, going for psychiatry and wound up, doing residency at Harvard Medical School. And so started there. And so Harvard was a fantastic place. And I think that, there's a reason why it has the reputation it has. So I went to Tufts for medical school. I went to University of Texas for undergrad, and winding up, doing psychiatry training at Harvard, like I could tell a difference, right? So there's a difference. So like the people there are super motivated. I found amazing mentors. I had people who kind of early on, like, I told them, I'm like, hey, my goal is to integrate, complementary and alternative medicine into psychiatry, and like, how do I do that? And I had some awesome mentors and stuff, and like they sort of gave me opportunities. I started teaching meditation on the inpatient psychiatry unit. I started teaching meditation in addiction rehabs. I started teaching meditation like all over the place. I taught it to physicians. I taught it to emergency room staff. I started working in jail. So they were like really awesome. They also helped me like sort of connect with research opportunities, and I started doing studies. And then I also was really interested in sort of like making it work financially. So I actually opened up my own clinic doing complementary and alternative medicine consultations for patients at Massachusetts General Hospital, which like my mentors were super supportive. It was fantastic. So there I am kind of like, on track. And then they also like were super supportive in terms of after I graduated, they were like, hey, if you want to do like, this kind of work in a rehab, or if you want to work here, you want to continue doing your consults, like we can build a program and stuff like that. They were awesome, really fantastic. So really visionary, very supportive, really, really high quality science. People helped me kind of think through things. And on the side, I've got this kind of like voice in the back of my head that's kind of like, but what about video games? Like people are playing a bunch of video games. Like what's up with that? So I started asking people, like everyone knew that I had like this resume, right? And like, I was kind of like geared towards that. That's what I was known for. People from the hospital would like email me and be like, hey, I've got a patient who needs, so like, who's interested in this. Like, what do you think about that? I was like, really cool. And then like I started asking people like, what do y'all think about video game addiction? It was like this kind of side thing, right? Like I'm the complementary alternative medicine guy. And they're like, what about video game addiction? And I went to one of my supervisors who's an awesome supervisor. And I kind of asked her, she was a psychoanalyst. And I asked her like, why do you think people get addicted to video games? And then, so she's like an older person, right? So was in her 70s at that point. And she was like classically trained, like, has been practicing psychoanalysis for like 40 years, 45 years. And so she was like, I think the reason people get addicted to video games is for the same reason that they get tattoos. And I was like, what? And she's like, then she like goes into this like really complicated explanation about like psychodynamic theory and stuff like that. And she was like, tattoos are all about like self-expression, and when we have like parts of our being that we can't vocalize and we can't express, then like we find some way to like express ourselves, and like people get lost in video games because like it's self-expression. It's like, lady, what are you talking about? Like, and so then I started asking like more and more people about video games, and I got a mix of responses. That was probably the most disconnected response. And then as I started like talking to all these experts in the field of psychiatry, like I realized like what I'm talking to is a bunch of people who are like older, right? So like if you think about leaders in the field of psychiatry, they're like in their 50s, in their 60s. And that's how you don't become chair of psychiatry, at Massachusetts General Hospital, or president of McLean Hospital, or like chief of psychiatry at, Harvard Medical School, or like whatever. Like, you don't get to be in that position at the age of like 35. Like, you just don't do that, right? You spend a whole career doing research, establishing yourself, going and presenting at conferences, getting grants, becoming an expert in something, becoming like an academic heavyweight. Like, there's a path to success at Harvard Medical School. And all of the people who are sort of leading the charge there, they don't really understand video games. Like, they haven't really played video games. And so it started to concern me a little bit. And during this time, I was like actually working with a lot of gamers, like on the side. I probably worked with about 500 gamers over the course of residency, like not as part of my job. I would just kind of help randos on the internet. And so what I started to realize is like these people are like suffering really, really bad. And like this is a real problem. There's a generation of people who are like lost and they don't know what to do. And so as I went to my mentors and I started to ask these really brilliant psychiatrists, really brilliant academics, like, what do we do about this problem? And they were good, right? So they recognized my passion, and, I had chosen to respect me despite my youth and my inexperience. And they were like, okay, here's how if you want to become an expert in video game addiction, like, here's how you do it. And they laid out for me the path of success. You apply for grants, like you don't really know much about it, right? It's a new phenomenon. So the first thing that you should do is like study for the phenomenon. So apply for this kind of grant. It's a 5-year grant. It'll give you funding. You can ask all these questions. You can try to understand video game addiction. And then after you get that grant and you sort of produce and you publish and stuff like that, then you can apply for a bigger grant, and then that'll fund you for another 10 years. And then you start doing studies, and then you can start doing interventions. We can start a clinic here, and we can kind of do like, you can see a certain number of patients, and we'll kind of do like these kind of interventions. And then like 10 or 15 or 20 years later, you'll understand video game addiction and you'll understand how to help these people, right? This is the road, and we can help you do it. And that's when I kind of realized like, this doesn't feel right to me, right? So like what I realized is like, there are people struggling, and like 20 years from now, like this is evolving so quickly that by the time I get my research funding for this grant to study, people with Diablo 3 addiction, like Diablo 3 is going to be dead. Like it's going to be done by the time the study ends. Like the pace of video gaming is like so quick that you can try to do a study on any particular video game, and like by the time you recruit subject from the study, no one's going to be playing it. Like if I want to study like people who play Fortnite, like, 8 months later, like they're not going to be playing Fortnite anymore, right? They'll have moved on to Apex Legends. They'll move on to something else. There's going to be something else. So I just realized that like the institutions that medicine has to study and evaluate a problem are like no longer working. And I think that that's a bold statement to make, and it's probably unfair, and there are lots of caveats to it, right? Like, so obviously there's like a lot of good things that medicine is doing. Like we have good treatments for psychiatry. We've got good treatments for COVID now. We've got a vaccine. So that's, I kind of retract that statement because it was a little bit hyperbolic. But what I mean is, especially when it comes to technology addiction and mental health, something isn't working here, right? So that I feel very confident saying that despite advances in medicine, despite tons of research towards neuroscience and psychology and stuff like that, mental health outcomes are not necessarily improving, right? Like, mental health got worse during the pandemic. Suicide rates continue to be high, like they've been kind of relatively high and stable in men for decades, and arguably even getting worse. So mental health has now surpassed cancer and cardiovascular disease in the United States, is the leading cause of morbidity and mortality, which is kind of staggering, right? So the biggest impact to our society's health now comes from mental health. And it used to be cancer, it used to be cardiovascular disease. And that's because I think part of the reason that the impact is so great is because mental health is like affecting young people at an alarming rate. Whereas if you compare things to like cancer and cardiovascular disease, it doesn't do a whole lot of damage to our 20-year-olds, our 30-year-olds, our 40-year-olds, our 10-year-olds, our 15-year-olds. But when you have someone who's depressed at the age of 18, drops out of college due to their depression and never finishes, that is a life of like productivity and like, involvement in society that kind of gets tanked. And we see this all over the place, right? We see this, in NEETs. We see this in ninis, ni trabajo ni estudiar. So we like, and I just got like, I got concerned that the institutions and approaches that we have are not paced well enough to deal with the challenges that we face. And so I did something super bizarre, right? So there I was at Harvard having a career, and, I worked there for, about a year afterward because I was still trying to figure out how to do this. But, like I had this career path planned out, and it was going to be like super successful. And I did the most bizarre thing. I walked away from it, right? And the reason that I walked away is because it sort of didn't feel right. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but what I realized is like, there's a path to success and someone has laid it out to me. Like they've laid out the red carpet and they've said, all you have to do is walk down it. And like, this is how you do it. We will help you. And it just didn't feel right. And so I think it's super bizarre, but I think that most of my success has come from walking away from things that are objectively successful and moving towards things that feel subjectively right. And I think that our society is like really strange, but I think it's like cool now that we live in a world where if you have a particular niche, if you have something that you care about, if you want to do things a different way, that society is well positioned to actually support you now more than ever. And I think about some of these indie games as like a great example of this. Like Undertale, for example, I think was made by one person, right? Axiom Verge was made by one person. And some of y'all may have never heard of these games, but I think it's a good example of like, there's a very clear niche, and like you don't have to follow the traditional path of success now more than ever, right? If you want to write a book, like now with the explosion of things like ebooks and e-publishing, I'm not saying that it's like an easy route, but like you can write more niche books. We're seeing a true revival of the fantasy genre because like so many people are like reading. And so you can write a book that you really like and that you're super passionate about. And there's a good chance that that book will be more successful than it would have been 30 years ago when everything was about mass market. And so I know it sounds kind of weird, but sometimes in life, and especially if y'all are trying to think about, what to do, you may sort of have this objective idea of what it means to be successful. And like what an objective idea of what it means to be successful is sort of like what everyone can kind of agree on. And we set our targets based on those kinds of ideas instead of actually tapping into and taking advantage of the things that make us unique. And so if you're really thinking about how to be successful, I know it sounds kind of weird, but like I would encourage you to follow your instinct and move in the direction that feels right to you. I'm not saying just follow your heart in sort of like, in an excuse kind of way to shirk your responsibilities. At each step of the way, I walked away from becoming a monk. I walked away from becoming an oncologist. I walked away from, being faculty. I mean, I'm still technically faculty at Harvard Medical School, but, I walked away from a job there and working there and following their path because it just didn't feel right. Like that system of addressing the world's mental health problems didn't resonate with like my personal goals. And so I walked away. And so sometimes I think being the most successful in life actually comes from, ironically, walking away from like excellent opportunities. I think the best decisions that I ever made were the ones where I walked away from a great opportunity. And so I would encourage all of y'all to think long and hard about what is it that you want? What is it that you care about? What is it that that you can do for the world? And you may think to yourself, oh, I can't do anything. Like I don't have any skills that are, worthwhile. And this is where, I'm going to use the example of professional DMs. Like, there's a crowd of people who are like, I'm a good dungeon master, but like, that's not a job, but it is, right? So because like there's a trend in our society where people are starting to institute more work-life balance. They're willing to, not everyone needs to drive, a $100,000 car. Some people just want to play D&D. Like I have a t-shirt, this is what I wear basically every day. I have jeans that are 8 years old. This fleece is like, good God, this fleece is now 7 years old. And I wear the same crap every day. What do I care about? I want to spend money on the things that I enjoy. And for a lot of people, those are things like video games and playing Dungeons and Dragons. And so there are a lot of things that you may care about. And I encourage you to like really think about, okay, how do I make this work? Right? Forget about what society tells you is the road to success. And take a look at our current situation and try to take a look at like, okay, what can I do differently? Because a successful psychiatrist is someone who has, a really nice private practice in a very fancy office and charges $600 an hour and all that kind of stuff. And like, that's what I was doing, right? So I had these like people, like these, tech startup CEOs and all these kind of people come into my office to learn about, meditation and work-life balance and the meaning of life and like dealing with their anxiety and dealing with their stress. And I'd put them on an Ayurvedic diet and give them these kinds of supplements and like teach them meditation. It's all evidence-based scientific stuff, and they'd get better, right? It was fantastic. That's what successful psychiatrists do. They don't stream on Twitch and talk to a group of people who are all essentially, well, we all aren't broke. That's not fair. I think I sometimes unfairly characterize Twitch. But, it's like, trying to like talk to gamers on Twitch, like how am I going to make money here? Like, why don't I charge $600 an hour? Like, I'm going to help randos on the internet for 2 hours and do what? And so then it becomes an issue of like trying to make it work, right? So then you have to be like a little bit calculating. You have to think about it. Okay, how am I going to make this work? How many hours? There's a reason why I only stream 6 hours a week. I literally cannot afford to stream like 8 hours a day like a lot of streamers do, right? I cannot afford it. And so I have other avenues of income and things like that. You find some way to make it work. And so I encourage all of y'all to think about, what is it that you can offer? What is it that you care about? Because I think what we see time and time again is that like a lot of the most successful stories that we see are from people actually following their passion, but in like a calculated and careful way, right? It's not like follow your passion, like sort of like use that as an excuse to shirk your responsibilities. I have 2 kids. I can't just follow my passion. I have to figure out some way to like, buy them clothing and buy them food and stuff like that. You can't just follow your passion. But I would encourage you to think long and hard about what is your approach to success and what do you think of as success, and take a step back from that and really listen to like your inner self. Because the big thing that I found is that, I showed up on Twitch and I offered you guys what I have to offer you. And it worked out really well because it's something that I care about. It brings out the best in me, right? Because y'all are the people that I care about. This is a place that I love, and these are people that I care about. And so it's going to bring out my best performance. So trust yourselves, listen to yourselves, and don't follow the traditional paths of success without thought. Be thoughtful about it. And what you may find somewhere along the way is that like you have to do that for a little while, right? Even if I had set out to do this work, I still think I would have said, okay, I need to get some kind of formal training as like a medical professional, because like that's how I need to understand gamers. I need to understand neuroscience. I need to understand spirituality. Like, this is how I would still do it. You still have to do things that you don't like. But once you're doing those things in service to your own goals, instead of like, the grind at your job so that you can get promoted, your experience of life, your enjoyment of life, and your performance will be so much higher. When the work that you do is aligned with your goals and things that you care about, even if you hate doing that particular work, it becomes so much easier. Questions? So one person's asking, do you need to do you need to succeed? How about just living a satisfying life? So it's a good question, right? So some people may say like, okay, like life is about satisfaction. I know it sounds kind of weird, but I'm going to say you need to succeed. And what I mean by that is like, you should have something in your life that you can be proud of. I don't think it's just, and maybe that's what satisfaction is. Like maybe you could define satisfaction as having a component of that. But I do think that like, just from a worth standpoint, right? Like I want y'all to build a life for yourself where you can wake up, and even if you don't enjoy your work, you can at least be proud of it, right? You can hold your head up high. You don't have to be embarrassed when people like ask you what you do or how you spend your time or whatever. It doesn't have to be like their barometer of success. Like you don't have to use their measurement of success. But I think in terms of yourself, if you have goals, you should strive to be successful. Absolutely. And you should sacrifice to achieve those goals. Like, absolutely. That's what I think ultimately leads to satisfaction is, setting a target for yourself that's aligned with the person that you are and like strive for success. Don't just chase. I mean, if you're calling success a part of satisfaction, then that's fine. But the concern that I get is some people will say, I want to live a satisfying life or an enjoyable life. And that may not be the same thing as well. But like there's some people who will sort of have more like, I'm going to live in the present and essentially live like a life of hedonism, of pleasure, right? And like maybe that means like eating tasty burgers all the time and like eating good food and stuff like that. But there's good evidence. There's a really fascinating study that essentially demonstrated that like suffering actually like, correlates with like, how can I say this? That going through something bad makes things more pleasant. So this is a really interesting, it's somewhat of a stretch of an interpretation. I don't have the reference right at the top of my head, but they did a really interesting experiment where they had people put their hands in like uncomfortably and painfully cold water. So they sort of like set it to like maybe -10 degrees or something like that. And they had someone stick their hand in it, okay? And so like that water is objectively worse. Like it's bad. It's objectively painful. And then what they did is they took a second group of people and then they had them put their hands in like -15 degree water, which is objectively worse than the -10 degree water. So they gave people a stimulus that is objectively worse than the prior stimulus. Towards the end, what they did is warm up the water from -15 to -10. So group number 1 had -10 all along. Group number 2 had -15 and then up to -10. So they were objectively started worse and ended up just as bad as group number 1. And people's experience of those two events, people in the second group complained less. They felt like it was a more pleasant overall experience and less painful overall experience, even though objectively their experience was worse. So as human beings, there's something, and I can sort of share this personally, where like when you stay up with your kid, like the first night that one of my kids had COVID, I had COVID too, but I woke up every 2 hours and checked her oxygen level because that's the scary thing, right? So it was like an exhausting night, but like it feels worth it, right? Like you wake up the next day and you feel like crap and you're exhausted, but you can take pride in it, right? Like I can be like, even though I feel like crap, I'm glad I did it and I'm like happy with the person that I am today. And a big problem that I see in people nowadays is that like, we're exposed to so much suffering without purpose. So if you look at like people who are like working in the grind, right? Like you can think about someone like an Amazon warehouse worker or like a UPS delivery person, and they can get compensated well, but like they're working really hard, but it's not for a purpose. And so I think a big part of satisfaction with life, a big part of like feeling successful and being proud of yourself is not the avoidance of pain. You don't need to avoid pain and gravitate towards pleasure. All you need to do is have pain for a damn good reason. And if you think about, like, I'm just going to think about a gaming analogy for a second, okay? So if I think about the games that I enjoy playing the most, the multiplayer games, like the best and most epic moments. The most epic moment in a video game is not when you stomp objectively from minute 1 to minute 30 and just destroy them. The most epic moments are the ones where you are behind and you make a comeback, right? So it's that water experiment. Is if you think about what makes the sweetest part of life, it's actually the bitterness that comes ahead of time. And this is also found in Ayurvedic medicine, where there's a particular herb called, what's it called? It's neem. It may have a different, Garwa limbro is like sort of the ethnic term, but neem leaves. So these are very, very bitter leaves. And if you guys can get these leaves, I encourage you to try them. It's a great meditation practice. So you eat one of these leaves and it's like so damn bitter. And then you drink water afterward and it tastes so sweet. And so it's so interesting. But I think when people are sort of asking, okay, like, do you need to be successful? Like, is it okay to live a satisfying life? And what I'd say is that, like, don't avoid pain and don't avoid suffering. Build a life for yourself where you can succeed through pain and suffering. And then you'll have a life that's truly satisfying.